What you are about to hear is a work of fiction. The people, places, and events depicted in this story are products of the author's imagination or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual individuals, living or deceased, or to real situations is purely coincidental. These stories may explore themes of crime, injustice, and human suffering. While fictional, they reflect real emotions and difficult truths that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
You have no right to those documents! Nora's voice echoed through the lawyer's office as she faced her stepmother across the mahogany desk, years of deception finally coming to light. But let's go back to where it all began, just 2 months earlier, when Nora Palmer thought she knew exactly who she could trust. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the small house on Maple Street as Nora sat at her kitchen table, sorting through condolence cards that still arrived weeks after her father's funeral. At 38, she had never imagined she'd be handling these final details alone, but here she was, a single mother trying to piece together the fragments of a life suddenly changed forever. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma, her 16-year-old daughter, peered around the corner with concern etched across her young face. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Nora replied, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "Just going through some of Grandpa's things. Please, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know just how far our stories reach." Nora's father, James Palmer, had been the cornerstone of their small family. A retired carpenter who built the very house Nora now lived in, he had raised her and her older brother Matthew after their mother died when Nora was 12. 5 years ago, he'd surprised everyone by marrying Diane Fletcher, a woman he'd met at the community center where he volunteered. At the time, Nora had been cautiously optimistic about the marriage. Diane seemed devoted to her father, but there had been small moments that nagged at Nora's memory. The way Diane's eyes had lingered a bit too long on her father's antique furniture when she first visited the house, how she'd casually asked about family investments during their engagement dinner. The slight irritation that crossed her face when James mentioned updating his will to include provisions for his children's inheritance. But grief had a way of softening harsh edges, and when James passed away peacefully in his sleep 6 weeks ago, Diane had been by his side, holding his hand and weeping what seemed like genuine tears. "He loved you so much," Diane had whispered at the funeral, her voice thick with emotion. "He was so proud of your teaching, of how you raised Emma on your own." Now, sitting in the quiet house that felt too empty without her father's presence, Nora wondered if she'd ever stop missing him. She taught art at the local high school, a job that barely covered the bills but filled her heart. Her father had always encouraged her artistic dreams, even when practical concerns forced her to choose stability over passion. The phone rang, interrupting her melancholy thoughts. "Hey, sis!" Matthew's warm voice filled the kitchen. Even at 42, her big brother still called to check on her regularly. His construction business 2 hours away kept him busy, but he never failed to make time for family. "Hi, Matt, how are things?" "I should be asking you that question. You sound tired." Nora smiled despite herself. Matthew had always been protective, especially after their mother's death. He'd been the one to walk her down the aisle at her wedding, and later, he'd been her shoulder to cry on during her divorce. "I am tired," she admitted. "I keep thinking I should go through more of Dad's things, but it's so hard, and Diane keeps saying there's no rush, that I should take my time." "Speaking of Diane, how is she holding up? And more importantly, have you two talked about Dad's will yet?" "She seems to be doing okay. She's been handling most of the estate stuff with Patricia Winters. I guess it's easier for her since she doesn't have the same emotional attachment to everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Nora, you remember Dad specifically told us the house and most of his assets would come to us, right? We talked about this when he updated his will after marrying Diane." "Of course. But honestly, Matt, I've been so overwhelmed with grief and work that I haven't really focused on the details." Diane said she'd take care of everything with the lawyer, and I was grateful for the help. Maybe I should drive down this weekend. Something about letting her handle everything alone doesn't sit right with me. You don't need to do that. I know you're busy with the Henderson project. The Henderson project can wait. You're more important. After they hung up, Nora felt a flutter of unease she couldn't quite name. She pushed the feeling aside and returned to the condolence cards, but Matthew's words echoed in her mind, along with those half-forgotten moments of doubt about Diane's true motivations. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Nora decided to look for her father's watch collection. He'd promised her his grandfather's pocket watch, a beautiful piece from the 1920s that had been passed down through generations. She searched his bedroom dresser, the places where he usually kept his valuables, but found nothing. "Diane," she called when her stepmother returned from her evening walk, "do you know where Dad kept his watches? I can't seem to find them." Diane's expression flickered for just a moment. Was that guilt? Before settling into a sad smile. "Oh, honey, your father had to sell most of those before he passed. You know how expensive his heart medications were, even with insurance. He didn't want to burden you children with debt." Nora felt her heart sink. "But the pocket watch? He always said that would go to me." "I'm sorry, dear." He felt terrible about having to let it go, but the medical bills were so overwhelming. Diane's voice carried just the right note of regret, but something in her eyes didn't quite match her words. That night, Nora lay awake thinking about the watches. Her father had been proud of that collection, especially the pocket watch. And now that she thought about it, his insurance had been excellent. Why would he need to sell family heirlooms for medical bills? The next morning brought unexpected clarity in the form of Patricia Winters, the family's longtime attorney, who called with an edge of urgency in her professional voice. "Nora, I need to see you today if possible. There are some concerns about your father's estate that require immediate attention." "What kind of concerns?" "I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you come to my office this afternoon?" At Patricia's office, the 60-year-old attorney wasted no time on pleasantries. She'd known the Palmer family for over 20 years, and her usually warm demeanor was replaced by the focused intensity of someone who'd discovered something deeply troubling. "Nora, I'm going to be direct with you. In the weeks since your father's death, your stepmother has been pressuring me to make changes to his will. Changes that don't align with the explicit instructions your father gave me when he was alive." Nora's stomach tightened. "What kind of changes?" "She's been insisting that your father made verbal modifications before his death, wanting to leave her the majority of his assets. She's even brought me what she claims is a handwritten codicil to the will." Patricia slid a document across her desk. "But this handwriting doesn't match your father's natural script." The paper in front of Nora looked like her father's writing at first glance, but something felt wrong about it. The letters were too careful, too deliberate, lacking the easy flow of his usual penmanship. "You think she forged this?" "I think your stepmother has been planning this deception for longer than any of us realized, and I believe she's already begun liquidating assets that legally belong to you and Matthew." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Those nagging doubts, those moments of unease or instincts had been trying to warn her. "What can we do?" Patricia's expression grew determined. "We're going to prove fraud, but we need to move quickly. I suspect she's been selling your father's possessions and transferring money out of accounts she has access to. Every day we wait, more evidence disappears." That night, Nora called Matthew with shaking hands. "Matt, I need you to come down here. Patricia thinks Diane has been forging Dad's signature and stealing from the estate." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said without hesitation. "And Nora? Don't let Diane know we're on to her." Matthew arrived the next morning with the kind of grim determination Nora remembered from their childhood when he'd protected her from neighborhood bullies. At 42, he still had the broad shoulders and steady presence that made people feel safe. "Show me everything," he said without preamble. They spent the morning going through their father's belongings together. Matthew's sharp eyes caught things Nora had missed in her grief. Spaces on the bookshelf where valuable first editions used to sit, the absence of their grandmother's jewelry box, the missing coin collection that had been displayed in the living room for decades. Nora, where's Mom's jewelry? The pieces Dad always said would go to you? Nora's heart sank as she realized she hadn't seen the jewelry since before their father's death. Diane said Dad gave them to her as a remembrance. Matthew's jaw tightened. Dad would never give away Mom's jewelry. He kept those pieces specifically for you. At Patricia's office that afternoon, their worst fears were confirmed. The attorney had spent the morning investigating and had discovered devastating evidence. "Your stepmother has been busy," Patricia said grimly. "I found records showing she's already sold approximately $50,000 worth of your father's possessions through online auction sites. The money went directly into a personal account she opened 3 weeks ago." She spread bank statements across her desk. "Here's the proof sales of the watch collection, your grandmother's jewelry, even some of the furniture, all sold within the past month." Matthew leaned over Nora's shoulder, his presence steadying her as the implications became clear. "She's been planning this since the day Dad died." "There's more," Patricia continued. "I discovered she's been forging your father's signature on documents to transfer money from his investment accounts. She's already moved over $100,000 that should have been part of your inheritance." The room spun around Nora as the full scope of Diane's betrayal sank in. This woman she'd trusted, who had comforted her in grief, had been systematically stealing her inheritance while playing the role of the grieving widow. "What can we do?" Matthew asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Patricia's expression grew determined. "We're going to confront her with the evidence and force her to confess. I've already contacted the authorities, and they're prepared to arrest her for fraud if she doesn't cooperate." "You mean we're going to trick her into admitting what she's done?" "Not trick," Patricia clarified. "We're going to present her with irrefutable evidence and give her a chance to make this right before the police get involved. If she's smart, she'll confess and agree to return what she's stolen." Over the next 2 days, Patricia worked with law enforcement to build an airtight case while Nora and Matthew gathered additional evidence. They documented every missing item, every suspicious transaction, every forged signature. The weight of Diane's systematic deception was staggering. "I feel so stupid," Nora confessed to Matthew as they sat in their father's living room. "How did I not see this?" "Because you're a good person who trusted someone Dad loved," Matthew replied. "But that doesn't make you responsible for her choices." Patricia arranged a meeting under the pretense of finalizing estate details. She told Diane they needed to review some final documents and get signatures on inheritance forms. What Diane didn't know was that everything would be recorded and that the police were waiting nearby. The morning of the confrontation, Nora's hands shook as she got dressed. Emma, who had been told only that there were problems with Grandpa's will, gave her mother an encouraging hug. "You've got this, Mom. Grandpa would be proud of how strong you're being." At Patricia's office, Diane arrived precisely on time, carrying a folder of papers and wearing the same sympathetic expression she'd maintained for weeks. She hugged Nora warmly, a gesture that now felt like a knife twisted in an open wound. "I know this is difficult, dear, but we're almost finished with all the legal requirements," Diane said in her practiced, caring tone. Patricia began by placing bank statements on the desk. "Diane, before we proceed with any inheritance documents, I need you to explain these transactions." At first, Diane maintained her composure, but as Patricia methodically presented evidence of each sale, each forged signature, each stolen dollar, her facade began to crack. "I don't understand what you're implying," Diane said when confronted with photos of the sold jewelry appearing on auction websites. "James asked me to handle these sales because they were too painful for the children." "Then perhaps you can explain why this supposed authorization bears your handwriting, not his," Patricia said, placing the forged document under a magnifying glass beside a sample of James's real signature. The differences were unmistakable. Where James's handwriting flowed naturally, the forgery showed careful, deliberate strokes. The pressure was different, the letter formations forced. Diane's face went pale. There must be some mistake. Matthew, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke. Diane, we know what you've been doing. We have records of every item you've stolen, every signature you've forged, every dollar you've taken. The police are waiting outside. Your only choice now is whether you confess or force us to let them sort it out. The mask finally slipped completely. Diane's carefully maintained composure crumbled, and for the first time, Nora saw the real woman beneath the act, desperate, greedy, and cornered. You don't understand, Diane burst out. I have massive debts. Credit cards maxed out, medical bills from my first husband's death that I never paid. When I married James, I thought I'd finally have security, but then he got sick so fast, and I realized I was going to be left with nothing again. So you decided to steal our inheritance? Nora's voice was steady now, strengthened by anger and hurt. I didn't plan this, but when James died, and I saw how much money there was just sitting there, I thought maybe I could take enough to pay off my debts and still leave you something. I never meant for it to go this far. You forged our father's signature, Matthew said coldly. You sold our grandmother's jewelry. You stole his watch collection. How is that not planning? Diane broke down completely, sobbing as she admitted to the forgeries, the sales, and the systematic theft of their father's possessions. As she spoke, Patricia discreetly signaled to the authorities waiting outside. You have no right to those documents, Nora found herself shouting as 2 police officers entered the room. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place where grief and betrayal had transformed into fierce determination to protect her father's true wishes. As Diane was led away in handcuffs, still sobbing about her debts and her desperation, Nora felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally out, anger at the betrayal, but also a strange sense of closure. Her father's legacy would be protected. The legal resolution happened swiftly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of a respected attorney, Diane quickly agreed to a plea bargain. She confessed to fraud and theft charges, was sentenced to 18 months in prison, and was ordered to pay full restitution for everything she had stolen. Most importantly for Nora and Matthew, Patricia had moved fast enough to freeze the accounts and recover the majority of the stolen assets. The items Diane had sold were more difficult to retrieve, but she was required to pay their appraised value as part of her restitution. 6 weeks after the confrontation, Nora found herself in a position she'd never expected to be in. With her inheritance restored and her father's true wishes honored, she had the financial security to make choices based on her dreams rather than just survival. What are you going to do now? Matthew asked as they stood in their father's workshop, now cleared of the projects he'd never finish. I think I want to open an art studio, Nora said, surprised to hear the words spoken aloud. Dad always said I should follow my passion for art. Maybe it's time I finally listened. Matthew smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since this nightmare began. He'd love that, and you know I'll help with the renovation work. The transformation took just 8 weeks. Matthew, true to his word, helped convert an old storefront downtown into a bright, welcoming art studio. Large windows let in natural light, and the walls were painted in warm colors that made everyone feel creative and hopeful. On opening day, Nora stood in the center of her new studio, watching as students of all ages explored the space with wonder. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, helped organize supplies and greet visitors with the confidence of someone who'd watched her mother face betrayal and emerge stronger. Welcome to Palmer Art Studio, Nora said to her first class, a mix of teenagers and adults who had signed up for evening painting sessions. My father always believed that everyone has an artist inside them waiting to be discovered. Today we're going to start finding yours. As her students began sketching, Nora caught sight of a framed photograph on her desk. It showed her father in his workshop, smiling as he held up a birdhouse he'd just finished. Next to it sat his recovered pocket watch. Patricia had tracked down the buyer and arranged for its return as part of Diane's restitution. The studio filled with the soft sounds of creativity, charcoal scratching against paper, quiet conversations about color and light, and the rustle of dreams taking shape. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast golden light through the windows, illuminating a space where art and hope lived together. Nora picked up her own brush and began to paint, surrounded by the community she was building and the legacy her father had truly left her. Not just money or possessions, but the courage to trust her instincts, to fight for what was right, and to turn pain into something beautiful. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her family had instead taught her that love and justice could triumph over greed and deception. Matthew had been her shield when she needed protection, Patricia had been her sword when she needed justice, and Emma had been her anchor when she needed hope. As the class ended and students began packing up their work, many lingered to talk about their projects and sign up for next week's session. One elderly woman approached Nora with tears in her eyes. "I haven't painted since I was young," she said. "I thought it was too late to start again." "It's never too late to create something beautiful," Nora replied, echoing words her father had spoken to her years ago. "Art is about expressing who you are right now, not who you used to be." That evening, as Nora locked up the studio and headed home to Emma, she felt her father's presence in the autumn air. He would have been proud, not just of the business she'd built, but of the strength she'd found to fight for his true wishes and create something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal. The inheritance Diane had tried to steal was more than money or possessions. It was the legacy of a man who believed in his daughter's dreams, who raised her to value truth over comfort, and who trusted that love would ultimately triumph over greed. In the end, that inheritance could never be forged or stolen. It lived in Nora's heart and in every brushstroke of every student who found their voice in her studio. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and from the darkness of deception, something beautiful had emerged. James Palmer's true legacy wasn't in the will that bore his name, but in the daughter who honored his memory by turning her pain into purpose and her dreams into reality. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.